Above 8,000 meters, there's a threshold where human survival becomes physically impossible. Only 14 mountains on Earth cross that line, all of them clustered in one region of Asia. Not dangerous, not difficult, impossible. Your body cannot acclimatize at this altitude, and every second you spend here, your cells are dying faster than they can regenerate. But here's what most people get wrong. 96% of deaths in this zone don't happen climbing up. They happen on the way down, because the death zone doesn't just attack your body, it attacks your mind. If you're fascinated by Earth's most extreme environments, subscribe and join the others exploring these places with me. The threshold where recovery stops. In 1952, a Swiss physician named Eduard Wisst-Dunant coined a term that would define high-altitude mountaineering forever: Todeszone, the death zone. He wasn't being dramatic. He was documenting something no one had formally described before, a specific altitude above which the human body enters a state where recuperation becomes physiologically impossible. The threshold sits at roughly 8,000 meters, about 26,200 feet above sea level. At this height, atmospheric pressure drops to barely 1/3 of what you'd experience standing on a beach. Your hemoglobin saturation, the percentage of oxygen your blood can actually carry, plummets from a healthy 100% down to somewhere between 30 and 34%. Legendary mountaineer David Breeshears compared the experience to running a marathon while breathing through a cocktail straw. Except the marathon never ends, and the straw keeps getting narrower. Wisst-Dunant put it simply: only one possibility exists there, since recuperation is non-existent. In other words, from the moment you enter the death zone, a clock starts ticking. Every minute you stay, you're borrowing time your body cannot repay. What makes this threshold so extraordinary isn't just the thin air, it's the geography. All 14 peaks that breach this altitude exist in a single compressed region of the planet, straddling the border between the Himalayas and the Karakoram Range. Nowhere else on Earth does the crust push high enough to create these conditions. These mountains aren't just tall. They're the only places where you can walk into a zone that actively kills you simply for being there. But oxygen deprivation is only the beginning. What makes the death zone truly lethal is what happens when 5 different factors converge at once. The 5 systems that fail simultaneously. Your body is a machine built for sea level. In the death zone, every system that keeps you alive starts competing against the others and losing. The first killer is hypoxia. Your brain and organs begin starving for oxygen immediately. The air contains the same 21% oxygen as anywhere else on Earth, but the pressure is so low that your lungs can barely extract it. Within hours, your cognitive function starts degrading. Climbers report forgetting why they're climbing, unable to remember basic decisions they made minutes earlier. Some have been found wandering in circles, convinced they're heading down when they're actually climbing higher. The second is extreme cold. At these altitudes, wind chill during climbing season averages around -45 degrees Celsius. In winter, it drops past -65. Your body faces an impossible choice: burn calories to stay warm or burn calories to keep moving. It cannot do both effectively. Facial frostbite can begin in 7 minutes during climbing season. In winter conditions, you have less than 60 seconds before tissue starts dying. Third comes dehydration. You lose liters of water simply by breathing. Each exhale releases moisture into the bone-dry air. Meanwhile, drinking water means melting snow, which requires fuel, which adds weight, which slows you down. Most climbers in the death zone are severely dehydrated, and dehydrated blood thickens into sludge. Your heart has to work harder to pump it. Your risk of stroke and cardiac arrest spikes. Fourth is physical exhaustion. At 8,000 meters, your aerobic capacity drops by roughly 65% compared to sea level. Every step requires the same effort you'd use at maximum exertion on flat ground. Your heart rate climbs to 140 beats per minute just standing still. The body burns through its reserves with terrifying speed, and there's no way to replenish them. You can't eat enough to replace the calories you're burning. Even digestion requires oxygen you don't have. The fifth factor is what ties them all together: cognitive impairment. Your brain is the most oxygen-hungry organ in your body, and it's the first to suffer when supply runs short. Judgment deteriorates. Risk assessment fails. Climbers make decisions that would seem insane at sea level: sitting down to rest in exposed positions, removing gloves in sub-zero wind, continuing upward when every sign says, turn back. Each of these factors amplifies the others. Cold makes you burn more energy. Energy depletion worsens cognitive function. Impaired judgment leads to dehydration. Dehydration thickens your blood. Thick blood delivers less oxygen. Less oxygen accelerates every other failure. This is why 96% of deaths happen on descent. Climbers reach the summit already damaged. Then they turn around and discover their bodies have nothing left to give. For decades, the medical establishment believed this cascade was absolute. Above 8,500 meters without supplementary oxygen, they declared, survival was physiologically impossible. Then someone proved them wrong. The man who made doctors rewrite the textbooks. On May 8, 1978, Reinhold Messner and Peter Habler stood on the summit of Mount Everest. No supplementary oxygen, no backup supply, just their lungs and the thin air that every expert said would kill them. The medical establishment had been clear. Sustained activity above 8,500 meters without bottled oxygen would result in rapid brain damage followed by death. The body simply couldn't function. Messner and Habler chose to treat this as a hypothesis rather than a fact. They reached the summit and descended alive. The textbooks had to be revised, but Messner wasn't finished. 2 years later, he attempted something even the climbers who believed in oxygen-free ascents considered suicidal: a completely solo climb of Everest via the technically demanding North Face during monsoon season, carrying all his own equipment with no support whatsoever. On August 20th, 1980, he reached the summit alone. Later, he described his mental state at the top. My mind was fully dead and only my soul was pushing me upward. It wasn't poetry. It was a clinical description of what happens to human consciousness at the edge of physiological possibility. Messner would eventually summit all 14 8,000ers without supplementary oxygen, a feat no other climber has replicated. His achievements forced a fundamental question that mountaineering science still struggles to answer. If the death zone isn't an absolute barrier, what is it exactly? A hard limit that exceptional individuals can briefly exceed? Or a frontier where the boundaries of human survival remain unmapped? The answer might lie not with those who push the limits intentionally, but with those who survived when they had no right to. The man they left for dead. May 10th, 1996. A sudden blizzard swept across Everest's upper slopes, trapping climbers at 27,000 feet with no visibility and plummeting temperatures. Among them was Beck Weathers, a Texas pathologist who had paid $65,000 to climb the world's highest mountain. As hypothermia set in, Weathers slipped into a coma. His body temperature dropped so low that other climbers couldn't detect vital signs. They radioed base camp with a simple message: Weathers was dead. In the brutal mathematics of the death zone, attempting to rescue someone likely to die en route simply increases the total body count. The team made the logical decision. They left him where he lay, without shelter, on the exposed mountainside. That night, the storm killed 8 climbers. Weathers was written off as the 9th. Then, the impossible happened. The next morning, Beck Weathers woke up. His right hand was frozen solid. His face had turned black with frostbite. He could barely see through ice-damaged corneas. But somehow, he stood up. And somehow, he walked back to Camp 4 under his own power. When rescuers found him, he was barely coherent, but he was alive. The cost of his survival became clear over the following months. Surgeons amputated his nose, his entire right hand, half of his right forearm, and all the fingers on his left hand. The frostbite had destroyed tissue so comprehensively that reconstruction required multiple surgeries over years. Weathers later wrote that he remembered almost nothing from that night on the mountain. His body had survived conditions that should have killed him within hours, but it had done so without his conscious participation. Something deeper, some survival mechanism that operates below awareness, had kept him alive long enough for the storm to pass. His case remains one of the most studied examples of extreme cold survival in medical literature. And it raised an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the death zone's limits aren't as fixed as we thought. 90 hours where no one should survive. If Beck Weathers' single night on Everest seemed miraculous, what happened on K2 10 years later defies explanation entirely. K2 is called the Savage Mountain for good reason. It's not as high as Everest, but it kills climbers at a far higher rate per attempt.
11 other climbers died trying to conquer the world's second highest peak.
The terrain is steeper, the weather more violent, and rescue more difficult. When something goes wrong on K2, it usually goes completely wrong. On August 1st, 2008, a massive sea rack collapse triggered an avalanche that swept away fixed ropes high on the mountain, stranding multiple climbing teams in the death zone with no way down. Over the next 3 days, 11 climbers would die. But Pemba Gyalje Sherpa refused to accept those numbers as final. When Pemba first discovered stranded climbers who had spent an entire night at extreme altitude without shelter, his initial reaction was simple: it's impossible to survive it. Conventional mountaineering wisdom agreed. At those temperatures, with that level of oxygen deprivation, survival beyond a few hours was not considered physically possible. Pemba went back anyway. He found Italian climber Marco Confortola alive after 36 hours of exposure at extreme altitude. Using emergency oxygen and his own body heat, Pemba revived him enough to begin descent. Then he continued searching. He located Dutch climber Wilco van Rooyen alive after 60 hours, 2 full nights without shelter in the death zone. No one in recorded mountaineering history had survived such exposure at that altitude. Pemba guided him down through terrain that had already killed nearly a dozen people. By the time Pemba finally descended to safety, he had spent 90 hours in the death zone. 70 of those hours were spent coordinating rescue operations at altitudes where survival is typically measured in single digits. National Geographic later awarded him Adventurer of the Year, but even the scientists who studied his achievement couldn't fully explain how he'd survived. His physiology, his decisions, his endurance, all of it operated outside the parameters that define human limits at altitude. Either Pemba Gyalje Sherpa represents an extreme outlier of human capability, or our understanding of those limits is fundamentally incomplete. The 100-year mystery, the ice finally released. The death zone has claimed lives for as long as humans have attempted these peaks, but some of those deaths left questions that persisted for generations. June 8, 1924. British climbers George Mallory and Andrew Irvine were last seen ascending toward Everest's summit, roughly 800 feet below the top. Their support team watched through a telescope as clouds swallowed them. They never returned. For a century, the mountaineering world debated a single question: did they make it? If Mallory and Irvine reached the summit that day, they would have beaten Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay by 29 years. The official record of the first Everest ascent would need to be rewritten. In 1999, a search expedition found Mallory's body at 8,160 meters, showing evidence of a fatal fall. His snow goggles were in his pocket, suggesting he'd been descending in darkness, possibly after a summit attempt, but Irvine's body remained lost, along with the camera they'd carried. If that camera were ever found, and if the film could be developed, the photographs might answer the question definitively. Then, in September 2024, a National Geographic expedition made a discovery that had eluded searchers for 100 years. On the central Rongbuk Glacier, emerging from retreating ice, they found an old leather boot. Inside was a sock embroidered with the initials A.C. Irvine. Partial foot remains confirmed the identification. The glacier that had hidden Irvine for a century was finally releasing him, accelerated by the same climate change that's transforming these mountains. The camera has not yet been located, but the search area has narrowed dramatically. If it's recovered, and if the film survived, we may finally learn what happened in those final hours before the clouds closed in. The limits keep moving. September 2025. Polish ski mountaineer Andrzej Bargiel climbed to the summit of Mount Everest, turned around, strapped on skis, and descended the entire mountain, through the Hillary Step, down the Lhotse Face, through the Khumbu Icefall, without supplementary oxygen. His total time in the death zone approached 16 hours. That's within striking distance of the maximum documented survival time for unassisted climbing at that altitude. Most climbers who've spent that long above 8,000 meters without bottled oxygen didn't survive the experience. Bargiel navigated the treacherous Khumbu Icefall, using drone guidance from his brother Bartek, threading through seracs and crevasses that have killed dozens of climbers over the decades. He reached base camp alive. This wasn't his first impossible descent. In 2018, he'd skied K2 without supplementary oxygen. In 2019, he did the same on Gasherbrum 1 and Gasherbrum 2. Each achievement pushed the documented envelope of what humans can accomplish at the edge of survivability. Either Bargiel possesses physiological advantages that give him capabilities beyond normal human parameters, or the limits we've accepted for a century need serious reconsideration. What the death zone teaches us about human limits. These mountains aren't just climbing objectives, they're laboratories for understanding what happens when human biology meets impossible conditions. Medical researchers study death zone survivors to develop better treatments for oxygen-deprived patients in emergency rooms. The protocols for treating high-altitude cerebral edema and pulmonary edema, conditions that can kill within hours, emerge directly from mountaineering disasters. Every climber who pushes into that zone and returns provides data points that might save lives at sea level. Space agencies pay attention too. The atmospheric pressure at 8,000 meters, roughly 1/3 of sea level, creates conditions analogous to near-space environments. Before we send humans to Mars, where atmospheric pressure drops to less than 1% of Earth's, we need to understand how bodies fail and adapt under oxygen stress. The death zone is the closest natural analog we have. Climate change is rewriting the rules as well. The 2023 Everest season was the deadliest on record, with 18 climbers dying in a single season. Part of the explanation lies in changing weather patterns and ice conditions that veteran guides say they've never seen before. The glaciers are retreating, exposing terrain that hasn't been visible in centuries, including apparently the remains of climbers lost 100 years ago. The death rate isn't uniform across all 14 peaks. Annapurna kills roughly 1 in 3 climbers who attempt it, the deadliest of all 8,000ers. Cho Oyu sits at around 1.2% fatality rate, the safest. Same altitude threshold, same physiological constraints, dramatically different odds. The mountain itself matters as much as the altitude, where the limit actually lies. Wistunant believed the death zone represented an absolute barrier. Cross that line, and recovery becomes impossible. Stay too long, and death becomes inevitable. His framework shaped how we understood high-altitude survival for generations. But Reinhold Messner climbed all 14 8,000ers without supplementary oxygen. Beck Weathers survived a night of exposure that should have killed him within hours. Pemba Gyalje Sherpa spent 90 hours rescuing strangers in conditions that should have been fatal in 10. Andrzej Bargiel skied down mountains while operating at the maximum documented limit of unassisted survival. These aren't just exceptional individuals. They're data points that don't fit the model. The death zone has killed over 340 climbers on Everest alone, but it's also produced survivors who shouldn't exist, people who woke up after being declared dead, people who functioned for days at altitudes where hours should be the limit, people who pushed through cognitive impairment so severe they later couldn't remember how they'd done it. Which raises the question that science still cannot fully answer. Where does the limit actually lie? Maybe the death zone isn't a wall. Maybe it's a gradient, a region where probability shifts against you with every meter gained, but never quite reaches zero. A place where exceptional physiology, extraordinary will, or pure luck can sometimes buy survival that the textbooks say is impossible. Only 14 mountains on Earth contain this threshold, and people keep proving that impossible needs an asterisk.